Welcome back to the Call of the Wild Mansions of Madness painting tutorial. No doubt some of you thought, where has he gone? Is it all about foam core now? Well, here it is. It's finally here, and in this part we'll be finishing these horrible monsters. This one and this one. But I'll be concentrating on this one because the techniques are pretty much the same. Now, this is the stage we got it to in the last video. A nice base coat. We did a bit of blending of colours. A sort of greeny colour here going to a pukey, horrible, browny colour there. And what I want to do here is darken the shadows a little bit and then start highlighting freehand. So, let's get to it! So the first thing I'm doing is taking my trusty Devlin mud, now known as Agrax Earthshade or something like that, and I'm going to selectively darken some of the areas on this miniature before I start highlighting up. Specifically the gaps between these horrible tentacles and around in the beard, but I'll leave the outer edges of these tentacles alone. So you can go straight from the pot, or you can add just a little bit of water. As you can see on the face, I've just used a flesh colour, and then I gave it a bit of a wash with Griffin Sepia, which I usually use to shadow flesh colours. There we go. I've got nice deep shadows in between the mess of tentacles in there now, and I've also darkened the end of the tentacles where they end in mouths. Now I'll let that dry before I go to the next phase. Okay, now I've deepened the shadows a little bit, I'm going to start highlighting. I'm going to start with the base colour that I put on originally and then get lighter from there, so we accentuate the highlights. So for this tentacle mass in here, I want a sort of greeny, grey, pukey, yucky colour, because it is a horrible creature after all. I'm using a relatively thick brush. So I've got a bit of green, a little bit of yellow. These are horrific otherworldly monsters after all. They're not pretty. Always watering down my colour a bit so it flows on nicely. And then I start roughly painting the tentacles. And as I put it on, I can judge the colour. So I think I'm a little bit too green there, so I'll put a little bit more yellow in. And really, this is hard for me to sort of give you rules on this, because it's kind of a painterly thing that you do by eye. And you can do it roughly, because you'll be seeing these from a distance. You're not seeing them really up close. They're not for painting for dioramas or anything like that. You just want them looking good when you play your board game. And what I'm doing is highlighting every little bit of tentacle with nice clean strokes, letting the brush do the work. This is where having a good brush really pays off. Now I've done that first highlight, I'm going to highlight with that olivey green and adding a bit of white. And the reason I'm doing that is because I want the greeny tentacles to have a whiter highlight, and the external tentacle feet things. What are these things? This thing is horrible! I want those things to have a more yellowy, tanny kind of highlight. So I've got a little bit of contrast between the two parts of the beast. So let's take a sort of greeny olive colour, in this case Gretchen green, and I'll add a little bit of white. And put on the highlights, this time in smaller strokes. Now, if there's too much contrast between the different levels of your highlight, you can always go back in with a sort of mid colour and blend in the highlights a bit more. I'm not going to worry too much with this figure because I want to get it done quickly, but if I was doing a piece that was more for display or that I wanted to look more impressive, I'd do more levels of highlighting and I'd more carefully blend between them. You can also blend while the paint is wet with a wet brush. But in this case we're doing relatively obvious highlights. You can see already that's just making those little bunches of tentacle pop out a bit more. Now, rather than do them all and make this video stretch out forever, I'll show you some of the top ones with a little bit more white and show you how they look in the end. So a brighter highlight, and this time I'm going for quite a narrow highlight. We're at almost white here, but judging the colours is just something that comes through experience. So you can just see in that area there that all the tentacle shapes are starting to pop out a bit because we've done a couple of levels of highlight. And just continue doing that over the entire figure. Right, now I've highlighted the greeny areas on this thing. I'm going to highlight these browny yellowy tentacles, and again it's just a matter of, in this case, adding a lighter colour such as Screaming Skull, which is nice and light, but it's not as light as white, so it gives me a slightly more interesting highlight. And I'll add that to the Dark Sun ochre yellow that I'm using and highlight that up. And you can see on the green here I've gone through maybe 2, sometimes 3 layers of highlight, and on just the bits on the top that's gone up to the whitest highlight. I'm using quite painterly strokes. If the difference between the highlight and the base colour is too severe, I can always blend it back in with a colour between the two later on, but at the moment I'm just getting a rough highlight stroke in. Depending on how confident you are, you can also blend together your colours on the palette. So here I've got more of the yellowy browny colour, and then I'm mixing in some of the green from the tentacles and blending them together. So I can use areas where these two colours blend together on the figure. I've got a nice shade of colour I can use so I get nice graduations between the colour. You can reserve your very lightest highlights for the very tips of areas that would be caught by the light. So for example, the very tips of the tentacles, you could paint just around the edge and the edges of these horrible mouths on the tentacles. You can see putting that really light highlight on the end there really makes that pop out. And we'll use those really light highlights for the very tops of the tentacles as well, like so. Paint the inside of these tentacle mouth things with a nice flesh colour, and then you can wash that with a dark wash, maybe a bit of red as well, and then pick out the tiny little fangs in bleach bone and then white. And do the same for the mouth areas. Just do a rough fleshy colour inside, give it a wash, and then pick out the teeth. And I think I'll make these lips a bit fleshy coloured as well, just to be truly disgusting. For the hair and beard around the face here, I'm using a grey dry brush, And dry brushing is always a good technique for hair and fur. Remember, just put some paint on the brush most of it off on a paper towel, and then just run it over the raised surfaces of the textured area. And then we'll highlight this up a bit with white. Now when this is dry, I'll give it another wash to make that blend in a bit better and darken it around the edges. There's the mouth with a wash of mixed Devlin mud and red. Okay, here's our horrible Dunwich horror. So what I've done here is finished his face. You can see these mouths. I've highlighted the teeth, and I've used a highlighting technique on the lips there, just short strokes of a much lighter colour to give a bit of texture to it. I've also dry brushed the feet in a darker colour, so that's just a rough dry brush, quite dark on the bottom there, and then I mixed a middle colour and dry brushed around the edge so it blended in nicely. That gives a nice feet colour to it. And then really you can go through and just touch up and highlight till the cows come home, frankly. Whenever you get sick of it, I think this looks great for playing on the board, but I could keep going and putting in more detail if I wanted to. Now with this other one, you can see here I've used a highlighting technique which is just drawing fine lines, bing, 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 just from dark up to light, and then on the very tips you've got quite a light highlight there, and on these little pimply bits here I've highlighted those. Same technique with the mouth, the fleshy colour, red browny wash, highlighting the teeth, and then pink and white highlights on the tongue and those other bits. And it's just a matter of going through and highlighting this by hand. So you can see right on the very tip of here I've got an almost white highlight, very light highlight. And if you exaggerate those highlights, you don't have to go through and do every single line throughout all the texture. You just do it on the highlighted areas and give it a sense of volume and exaggerate the highlights as though it was a large object instead of a hand-shaped object. And there you have it. They're the two main figures for the Dunwich horror. And that brings us to the end of this series on painting the Call of the Wild Mansions of Madness figures. All that remains now is to give these a varnish, and for that I use a semi-gloss varnish. This is the one, but you can use gloss or matte depending on your preference. I do a semi-gloss one because it's nicely between the two, and then I'll paint a bit of gloss varnish around the mouth areas where I want it to be particularly glossy and horrible. And that's about it. So I'll be putting photos of the finished figures on the website for your reference. And thank you very much for watching. Night is closing in now, and I really do feel it's time that I brought this to a close, because I can hear what the light. It's getting dark. There's something out there. There's something out there. It's getting. It's in the trees. It's coming. Ah! No! No! Please! Please no! No! No!